It is a cold morning in London, in the autumn of 1953. A man sits at a polished table in a townhouse at number 2, Carlton Gardens. His name is George Blake. He is 31 years old, quiet, polite, and fluent in 5 languages. His job in this room today is simple. He is taking the minutes. Around him sit the most senior intelligence officers of Britain and the United States. They are discussing a plan that exists nowhere else on paper. They are going to dig a tunnel out of West Berlin. It will run under the border into the Soviet sector. It will reach the buried cables carrying the Soviet Army's most secret telephone calls. And through those cables, the West will listen to the Soviet Union itself. Blake writes it all down. Every detail, every cable, every measurement. He is thorough. He is a good note-taker. The meeting ends. The officers shake hands and disperse into the London afternoon, and George Blake walks out with the minutes in his coat. He takes them to the KGB. Not one shovel has touched the ground. The tunnel does not exist yet, and the enemy already knows everything. What happens next is one of the strangest episodes of the entire Cold War, because the Soviets do not stop it. They let the Americans dig. For 11 months, they let them listen, and the reason why is stranger than the betrayal itself. George Blake was not a Russian. He was born in the Netherlands. As a boy, he had run messages for the Dutch resistance against the Nazis. He escaped to Britain, and after the war, British intelligence recruited him. He was clever, disciplined, and utterly unremarkable to look at. Then, in 1950, he was posted to Korea. When the war broke out, he was captured. He spent 3 years as a prisoner of the North Koreans. And somewhere in those 3 years, he changed sides. The KGB gave him a code name. They called him Diomid. In 1953, he came home to Britain as a war hero. They welcomed him back, promoted him, and trusted him completely. And then they sat him down in a room and asked him to take the minutes. To understand the tunnel, you have to understand what the West had lost. For years, Western intelligence had listened to Soviet radio traffic. Then, in the late 1940s, the Soviets went quiet. They moved their most sensitive communications off the airwaves. They put them onto buried telephone cables instead. Cables cannot be intercepted from the air. They can only be reached by touching them. Overnight, the West went deaf. And Berlin was the answer. Berlin sat at the center of the Soviet communications network in Europe. Almost everything running between Moscow, Warsaw, and Bucharest passed through it. The city was cut into sectors, guarded, watched, and permanently tense. Beneath its streets ran the cables that carried the secrets of an empire. The British had done something like this before. In Vienna, they had run an operation called Silver. They bought a building, opened a fake business, and dug a 70-foot tunnel to the Soviet lines. The cover was an import company selling Harris tweed. It thrived, which was almost inconvenient. Silver worked, and the Americans wanted the same thing in Berlin. But Vienna's tunnel had been 70 feet. Berlin's would have to run 1,476. That is longer than the Empire State Building is tall. The man who would build it was the CIA's Berlin station chief. His name was William King Harvey. He was a former FBI agent, and J. Edgar Hoover had fired him. He drank, he carried a pistol, and he did not lose arguments. His British counterpart was Peter Lunn, the head of the MI6 station. Officially, the operation had a code name built from their first names, Peter and Bill. The Americans called it Operation Gold. The British called it Operation Stopwatch. Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, approved it in January of 1954. And George Blake had already told the KGB, to hide a tunnel, you first have to hide the hole. So the Americans built a warehouse in Rudo, at the southern edge of the American sector. They put radar antennas on the roof. They made it look like a signal station, dull and unremarkable. Soviet guards watched it from across the border and saw nothing worth reporting. Beneath it, the digging began in the autumn of 1954. They went down about 20 feet. Then they turned east toward the Soviet sector. The tunnel was 6 feet across. It was lined with steel plate, ring after ring, driven forward foot by foot. They removed 3,100 tons of soil. Every ton of it had to disappear without anyone noticing. So they stacked it inside the warehouse, quietly, endlessly. The work was miserable. On the eastern side, the solid clay gave way to running sand. Water seeped in. The men worked in the cold and the wet, in silence, under the ground. The most dangerous point was the very end. There, the target cables lay barely 3 feet beneath a busy road. Above the diggers' heads, Soviet trucks rumbled past. One collapse would have ended everything. They used 125 tons of steel plate to hold the earth back. The first estimate for the whole operation had been $50,000. The final cost ran to millions. It cost about as much as 2 U-2 spy planes. The digging finished on the 28th of February, 1955. Then came the hardest part of all. They had to touch the cables without the Soviets ever knowing. British cable specialists were brought in for the job. They cut a vertical shaft up to the cables from below. Then they worked in a chamber the size of a coffin. The first cable was tapped on the 11th of May, 1955. The second on the 21st of May. The third on the 2nd of August. Amplifiers were installed to carry the signal back down the tunnel. Reel-to-reel recorders waited at the other end. And then, 6 feet under a road in East Berlin, the West began to listen. What came out of those cables was extraordinary. The Soviets, certain their landlines were safe, spoke freely. They talked about troop movements. They talked about air defenses. They talked about the order of battle of the Soviet and Warsaw Pact armies. They named the people working on Soviet atomic energy projects. They revealed the first signs that East Germany was building an army. They argued with the East Germans about the future of Berlin. They talked about ordinary things too. Officers calling home. Complaints about the railways. The recordings piled up beyond anything the Americans had prepared for. They filled roughly 50,000 reels of tape. Hundreds of thousands of conversations were eventually transcribed. The material was so vast that it took more than 2 years to process. Trucks carried the tapes out of the warehouse under guard, and out of it came around 1,750 intelligence reports. For 11 months and 11 days, the tunnel worked perfectly. The men underground believed they were winning the Cold War. They had no idea they were being watched. From the very first day, the KGB knew. They had known since Blake handed over the minutes in London. Blake had even drawn them a small sketch of where the tunnel would run. But knowing created a problem the Soviets had not expected. If they stopped the tunnel, they would expose Blake. There were only a handful of men who could have leaked that plan. If the tunnel was raided too early, the British would work backwards and find him. And Blake was worth more than the tunnel. He was inside MI6. He was betraying agent after agent. He would eventually give the KGB the names of hundreds of Western agents in Germany. So the Soviets made a cold decision. They would let the tunnel run. They would sacrifice their own secrets to protect their spy. And here is the strangest part of all. They did not poison the well. They could have flooded the cables with lies. They could have fed the Americans a false picture of the Soviet army. But that would have required telling the Soviet army it was being tapped. And the KGB would not do that. They did not tell the Red Army. They did not tell the East Germans. They did not even tell their rivals in Soviet military intelligence. The secret was held by a tiny circle of men. Everyone else kept talking on the lines as normal, which means the intelligence the Americans collected was real. Years later, the CIA studied it and confirmed exactly that. The Soviets had not fed them a single lie. To protect one man, an empire let its enemy listen to the truth. By 1955, George Blake had been posted to Berlin. Then he was moved on again. With Blake safely away from the operation, the Soviets were finally free to act. They needed an excuse, and the weather gave them one. The spring of 1956 was exceptionally wet. Rain seeped into Berlin's telephone network and caused faults across the city. The Soviets announced they were sending crews out to repair faulty cables. It was the perfect cover. On the night of the 21st of April, 1956, soldiers began to dig. They dug at the municipal cemetery in Altglinica. in East Berlin. They dug at 3 to 5 foot intervals along the cable route. Inside the tunnel, the Americans heard them coming. Their microphones picked up the sound of shovels above. 40 to 50 Soviet soldiers were working directly over their heads. The men below knew it was over. They pulled back down the tunnel and left. The Soviets broke through into the tap chamber. They found the amplifiers, the cables, the recording equipment. They found a tunnel running back under the border into the American sector. And at the borderline underground, they found a sign. It had been left there for them to read. It told them they were now entering the American sector. Moscow had planned a propaganda triumph. They invited the world's press underground. They called it a gangster act and a breach of international law. And then the plan collapsed in their hands. Because the newspapers did not print outrage. They printed astonishment. The world read about a tunnel a quarter of a mile long, dug under an enemy city. They read about steel plate and pumps and the nerve of the men who built it. The Soviets had tried to humiliate the West. Instead, they had handed it one of the great legends of the Cold War. And George Blake was still inside MI6. He stayed there for 5 more years. He kept working, kept passing names, kept destroying networks. Then, in 1961, a Polish intelligence officer defected to the West. His information pointed at a mole inside British intelligence. Blake was in the Middle East at the time. He was recalled to London on a pretext. On the 3rd of April, 1961, he was arrested. He pleaded guilty. He admitted betraying hundreds of Western agents to the KGB. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison. It was the longest sentence handed down in modern British history. 5 years later, in 1966, he escaped. An Irish former inmate and 2 anti-nuclear campaigners smuggled him out. They threw a rope ladder over the prison wall and drove him away. He crossed Europe hidden in a van and reached Moscow. The Soviet Union gave him a flat, a pension, and a medal. He lived there for more than 50 years. He never expressed regret. He said he had believed in something and had served it. He died in Moscow in 2020 at the age of 98. The Berlin Tunnel is remembered as one of the boldest operations the West ever attempted. It was also compromised before the first shovel went into the ground. Both of those things are true. The men who dug it were never betrayed by their own work. They were betrayed in a quiet room in London by a man taking notes. And yet the intelligence they carried out of that tunnel was true. The Soviets protected their spy so carefully that they let the truth through. 11 months and 11 days of it. Every word of it real. For the price of one man's name.